So I just made some pocket patterns for my Patreon patrons, and I realized just how many options there were with this pocket. And I was making a video, and the video just got bigger and bigger and bigger. So I just decided that I'd make this video for everybody. Maybe you don't have these pattern pieces, but if you ever come across this pocket or you're drafting them, this is some of the sewing techniques that I utilize when I use this pocket style, because it's one of my favorites. I really love how low profile it is. I love that my pocket, if it's stitched to the garment, stays forward always, so that it's not like slipping behind me, you know, one of those pants that do that. And you can use very little fabric, which is really great because sometimes we're cutting it kind of close and at the last second we're like, oh shoot, I really want pockets. And if you have a little bit in yourself, you can just do, you know, 2 pieces of pocket and it's pretty small. So there's lots of different ways to put this together. So I kind of did 3 that showcase all the options. So on this one here, this is a fully lined, even the top edge here, and it has a facing so that you can't tell that the pocket lining doesn't match, and then it's stitched down. So now if you had more seam allowance here, you could actually stitch the pocket just to itself and let it hang free, and then you'd have the cutaway pocket style with this little peekaboo panel here, but then it would hang free and you wouldn't have this stitching. So that's kind of a fun element. All right, on this one here, I utilized a facing finish for the curve opening, but then I used contrast to kind of highlight the fact that I have this little peekaboo panel, and this would be really fun with stripes and putting the stripes different directions, or maybe just a completely different color there. I've seen all kinds of really fun ways to do these cutaway pockets. And this one too is serged and stitched down. I didn't serge this one just because of the time saving. And then this one also is just 1 layer of fabric, and then there's just a facing here. So very minimal fabric, and I used self here. You could use self here. And on this one, I used a binding opening and 1 layer of fabric as well. And I almost got my prints to line up there, so you can tell if you lined up your prints and planned it really good, it'd be almost invisible. This one is stitched down as well, and it has this little binding opening. So this would probably be the least amount of fabric you could use, and it would also drape the same as the garment because it's with the garment and it's the same fabric. But you know, if you were wanting something that maybe you're doing a pretty heavy duty garment and you wanted light, you know, less bulk, you could use the pocket lining in a different fabric. So there's lots of different options here, and once you start sewing it, you can start choosing what you want. You're going to start realizing how versatile it is. And like I said, this pattern is available to my tier 2 Patreon patrons. It's pretty low-key pattern, but you get the video and you get the pattern pieces, and then and you get me anytime you have a question about it. All right, enjoy, happy sewing, and I hope you like making cutaway pockets as much as I do. All right, I have 3 ways to finish that curve opening of your cutaway pocket. I have binding, which I find to be the lowest profile, probably the least obtrusive, and sometimes it's just kind of the quickest way to get it done. And then I have a facing, or a pocket lining, so a top pocket, so it's a fully faced, and it'll get stitched to the bottom pocket. And then we have a facing here, which you could just use in place of binding as well. And remember, your pocket's going to stitch down through these raw edges right here because it's stitched to the garment, unlike a pocket bag that's hanging free on a side seam pocket or similar like that. So this facing, and you know, you can employ different ways to finish these, showing the edge stitching or just using an understitch, and that might drastically change or make it more prominent or less prominent. So I'm going to sew all 3 of those. This is the first one. So if you've already got your cutaway there, you have your pocket facing that's going to sew to this. And so now when you're doing this, one of the things to think about when you're cutting out your pieces, like if you're cutting 2 of everything because you have 2 pockets, when you get to the sewing step, it's up to you whether you want the right side of your lining to face inside the pocket so that your hand gets the best view of your pocket lining, or you can do it so that it faces out to where when your garment's inside out, you can see the right side of the lining. I always forget that that's the way I prefer it. I always end up sewing my pockets on, and I always end up tearing them out and redoing it because I love it so much. So, all right, so this is how this is. So it looks like it's wrong side, like it's going to the wrong side, but This is as if my pocket is going to face out to the world on the inside of the garment. All right, so I have 3/8 inch seams on this pattern piece. You can increase it or decrease it however you like. My preference is always 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch for wovens, but 1/4 inches for these kind of narrow spots here. I just made it 3/8 inch across the board on these pieces. All right, and we're going to clip this curve here. And now it's up to you if you want to understitch this edge, iron it to the inside, or edge stitch it. It doesn't make a difference. It's just your preference on what you want visible on the outside. This is one pocket where you can't get away with hiding the fact that there's a pocket there because you're stitching around the perimeter and there is this little cutaway opening that's visible. But if you want it to be as kind of, you know, unobtrusive as possible, I would opt for the understitching and not the edge stitching. So, all right, we're going to do understitching on this one. Just be careful if you do the edge stitch one, and even on the understitch a little bit, don't stretch out this curve as you're sewing. You'll end up having a pocket opening that's a little bigger or kind of wavy, you know. It'll calm down after a while, but it might make you a little disappointed. All right, so here we are. We have this fully faced top pocket now, and then it's just waiting for its under pocket. It needs a good pressing, obviously. And like I said, the right side of the fabric would face out to the inside of the garment. My hand doesn't get the best view. All right, so let's go to our next one. So the next one would be the facing. And on this pattern piece, I have a little notch just indicating for me which way this goes because it's so similar top and bottom. So I'm going to line it up to my notch. Right sides together if I want. And this time I will do right sides together. It's a pretty subtle difference on this fabric here. And same thing, we're going to clip this curve. Now you can finish this facing 2 different ways and make it any width that you like. So for this one right here, you know, I can, like I said, I can understitch it, push the seam allowance towards the facing, or I can press the whole opening and then edge stitch it. You can do neither too. I've done that. You can just leave it really clean, but I think the understitching is the way to go for sure, at least. I love the way it looks when there's just no stitching at all and just an understitch. And the other thing is that when we go to our next step now to finish this off, you can overlock this edge and then top stitch it down. You can turn it under and edge stitch it, and then your stitching is obviously going to show on the right side either way. You can even trim this down a little bit and just pretend like it's binding and make it really narrow, just like binding would be if you're just a little more uncomfortable with binding. But binding this kind of little opening, this is perfect for binding. It's actually pretty easy, especially since we're not binding the edge. It's the best way to do it, I think. I mean, not the best way. It's the easiest way to handle binding is when the binding goes all to the one side of the piece that you're sewing it to rather than it straddling around the edge. So I'm going to press this all to the inside and I'm going to edge stitch this one. And then I'm going to clean finish this facing by turning it under and edge stitching it. But if you want to overlock it, I think that's great too. It just depends on what you're going for, or if you have a serger, or maybe your serger's not set up with the right color thread like mine is right now. Okay, I'm back from the iron, and when you're ironing something as finicky as this, what I like to do is I treat it kind of like I'm sewing a French seam. I press the seam allowance towards one direction. It doesn't matter which direction, but it'll be easier probably to press it towards this little facing, and then I fold it back on itself along that edge and then iron it. And I try and make sure that a little bit of the outer fabric is visible, and you can cut this piece in whatever fabric you want, a contrast or a matching fabric. It just depends on what your garment is. All right, so I'm gonna like finish this little edge here, and I think I'm going to cheat. I hate that expression. It's not cheating at all. I'm just going to show you this method. I don't usually employ this, but on a curve like this, I think this would be really great, and I think I should use it more often. I'm just going to put a running stitch about 1/4 of an inch along this edge. It doesn't have to be any longer. And now I'm just going to pull one thread, kind of like I'm gathering it, but more that like I'm doing a set-in sleeve. I call this an easing stitch. So let's just pull this. This is really great on any kind of curved hem that's really giving you a lot of trouble. Like I said, I probably wouldn't do it for this opening because no one's really going to ever see this side of my pocket. But I think this is such a great way to give you an option if you really hate hemming those curved things, and I feel it on that too. I'm not a big fan either. That's why sometimes even overlocking this edge, even if you're going to turn it under and hem it like I'm about to, overlocking this edge first makes it even easier. There's something about the overlock that kind of pulls it, kind of stabilizes that edge there, and then that way it is really easy to turn it on that serging. My only issue with that is a lot of times the serger threads can kind of poke out if you can't turn past it. So first we're going to edge stitch this opening. Keep it nice and relaxed. Like I said, you don't want to stretch out this little curve here. You want it to lay as flat as possible when it's finished on the body and on the garment. You don't really want to call attention to this little curved opening. I tend to be a puller when I sew, and so this would be the perfect thing that I would sit there and make really tight, and then my little curved openings would be above, you know, like floating above my garment, and everyone would be able to see inside my pockets, you know. So they could use a good pressing. So now I've got this little edge drawn up a little bit, kind of in an exaggerated way, and we're going to just turn it under and edge stitch it down. You can press it first. It'll lay nicer. But even without pressing it, it behaves pretty good. You don't want this to be too tight. I have it a little bit too tight right here. You don't want it to be too tight because then you won't make it all the way to the end. You'll run out of fabric. And you also don't want your you know, pocket opening to be tight along that facing stitching edge. All right. Here we go. So I got a little piece of lint in there. All right, so this could use a good pressing, but now we have our other pocket style opening, and now we're going to do the binding. So for this one, we're going to bind this opening, and I feel like that this pocket really is conducive to using one with binding. I just cut mine about 8 inches long, a little over, and 1 inch wide. You don't really need anything wider when you're just binding to the inside. And when you're putting this on, try not to stretch the binding at all. Try and keep it as relaxed as possible. The way I like to explain this is that this, if you were to measure along the seam line of this curve and then measure also where this binding is going to be stitched down on the final step, that amount is different, those two lengths, but the binding piece is only one length. And so you're asking the binding to be shorter on one end and longer on that other edge. So for something like this where the binding goes into the inside of the garment, like on a neckline or something, and I have a whole video on how to sew that because I find those to be really tricky and they're not my favorite neckline finish. I think that not stretching it, which is usually my MO, I love just to kind of gently pull binding when I sew it on. Keep it as relaxed as possible. Make sure you're not stretching out this curve either. And I'm just using a 1/4 inch seam on this for binding. And now we're going to clip this curve and press it. Normally on binding I wouldn't, but on something like this little opening, it's going to be a little more finicky, and it's operating more as a facing rather than binding, because we're not binding the edge, we're facing the edge with a piece of binding, right? All right, so let's iron that. Okay, we're back from the iron and we're going to just turn under this edge here. And I kind of like to just fold that edge to the stitch line, which is kind of a nice guide. It wraps around the seam allowance really nicely and it keeps it nice and even, as long as I was even on that first seam. Yeah, not always, but I try. And then I just stitch it down. Now you might be gently tugging your binding a little bit because, like I said, this length is longer than that first seam we just did. In general too, I will edge stitch this almost always. I edge stitch the binding before I do this step. I edge stitch it right here, but honestly I feel like, and I do this every time, in fact if you've seen me on camera on the live stream, I almost always edge stitch it, and probably in that neckline video I do as well. But on something this short, I actually feel like it's going to lay flatter without edge stitching it, because edge stitching kind of fixes it and kind of binds it a little bit. And on the neckline, you kind of almost have to do it because you're fighting that binding from creeping to the right side of the garment. And on something like this, it's a nice small little opening. It's probably not, you're not going to have that much fight in that you're going to have to deal with. So I would skip the edge stitch. Just make sure when you iron it that you can just see, you know, a little skosh of your outer fabric kind of peeking past this edge right here, so that you know this binding isn't showing on this side, just like that. And that looks pretty good, you know. And then I'll even it up with the side seam like this, and then this edge is ready to go. Always take your binding past this edge so that it meets this further, you know, like right here, this is shorter than right here. So make sure you always let your binding kind of hang off. All right, this pocket's really versatile, and I think this sewing the bottom will just really underscore that, because you're gonna see that how different it can look with different fabrications and different sewing styles. So for this bound edge, I'm going to put a matching pocket piece underneath. And I even matched up the little hot cocos. I didn't spend a lot of time on it, so hopefully it does match. And so then that way it's virtually invisible. But remember, we will have that stitching around the perimeter edge. So if you're really going for something that kind of disappears, or you just, you know, want it to just be as seamless as possible, besides that pocket stitching and this cutaway, this is pretty much your go-to. So all right, so the way I would do this is I would overlock this edge, or I would sew and turn it under and top stitch it down, and it's your choice. So the other one I have here is same thing. I would just use another single layer. It's also going to be a lot less bulk and everything, but is as a contrast fabric. So say you had some stripes going horizontal on your body and you do them vertical here, or vice versa. I think that that's kind of a fun way to play with the print, and then just, you know, utilize that cutaway to your advantage and accentuate it. So the sewing for this would be the same as that first one, where I would overlock this edge, or I would turn it under and top stitch it and line it up with that facing on this one particularly, and then just top stitch it down, or turn it under and top stitch it down. And we can use that technique where we stitch around it and press it, kind of pull up threads and press it down. I personally, this is where I do like using my serger, just, you know, overlocking that edge and then top stitching it down. And if you're doing a contrast, you have to do it from the top side, so maybe you give yourself a guide of some pins or chalk or something so you can see where your pocket bag is. Lastly, but kind of not lastly, because there's just a lot of different possibilities with these pockets. If you want the full pocket lining, you know, like this, that you wanted to face your garment or your curved opening there, I still stitch this down because it's you know, you can make enough seam allowance on top and bottom to where the bag hangs loose. But for me, the beauty of the cutaway pocket is that the pocket is always towards the front of the garment, and it's not like slipping to the behind you, and I really like that. So this one, I put the fabric so that the cute side is face out on the inside of my garment, and I don't really want to show that. Even if I had contrast and it was facing the inside with my hand, I can always put a facing here to line that, and then that way that's what you see, and it looks a little bit more seamless. And that is one thing to note, is that say you're doing this on a dress, like I did this on my Myosotis dress, which was a double gauze, so it was a really light and airy fabric. I don't think there were pockets on that pattern, so I decided to add the cutaway mainly because it's so voluminous and there's a lot of gathers, that I find the cutaways to be really easy to find and stick my hands in a little, faster. So what I did was I bound the edge, and then I just used one layer of the self fabric underneath, and so it's pretty much invisible. But if you were using, say, a fabric that was really lightweight or maybe really heavyweight, and maybe you want your pocket bag to not be really bulky, then you could use a contrast fabric for the inside, just purely out of a way to reduce the bulk of the pockets. And it's the same thing if you don't feel like your pockets are going to be sturdy enough on a really lightweight garment. You can maybe pick something with a tighter weave or something that's a little bit more stable, so that if you're throwing your car keys in there, you're not really worried that eventually that seam might, poke out, something might poke out that seam. All right, so let's get to sewing these. We'll start with this one here. So on this one here, you can overlock this edge or just turn it under and top stitch it down along this edge here. So I'm just going to turn it under like 1/4 of an inch and edge stitch it. Keep it lined up along the side seam. And we'll trim this flush. And now this is ready to go. So like I said, this one here is a pocket that's going to be stitched down to the garment, but if you had more seam allowance here, you could stitch it to itself only and then have a free hanging pocket bag. So mine isn't like that. So I'm just going to pretend like I've overlocked around this edge here, and I'm just going to stitch it down right directly onto the garment. I really love the stability that adds. Now, if you know me at all, you know that sometimes I might cheat and even just never finish these edges of the pocket bag. I know some of you are probably just cringing hearing that, but the thing is, the pockets, there's so much bias on it that a lot of it doesn't fray. In certain fabrics it works, and it's just so much less bulk. I really am a big fan of not always finishing these edges. If it's just not going to show, it just hangs nicer inside the garment. It flows better with the overall garment, and it's less bulk. And I'm just not a purist about finishing the seams. So there you go, that's stitched through. And then I like to secure this little edge here. And now you can carry on with sewing the rest of your garment and just treat this like a side seam, and your pocket's out of the way. You've got a nice little pocket there. All right, so for this one, I've overlocked this edge here. Just line it up to the bottom of the raw edge of this facing here. And because I did the contrast thread on this one, obviously I would never sew it like this in real life. I can actually see the serging, so I could just do it from the top if I wanted. When you're going around those curves down there, like I said, if you don't stop, you're going to get a smoother curve, but I know how tricky that can be. And this is probably far more visible to me than it is to you right now, and I made that look really easy, but trust me, if you saw me do the Yanta overalls, you saw that I really was careful. All right, so same thing, we're going to secure this edge here and here, and now we've got our pocket. There we go. All right, one more. Now see, this one has the same kind of finish where we could just overlock that edge and then top stitch it on. The only reason I did this one was because I needed 3 top pocket openings, and it is a good opportunity to show that you can really blend in that fabric to where it's not going to show, especially if you cut it better than I did. So on this one here, we'll do the long thing of turning under the edge. So I'm going to put a running stitch about 1/4 of an inch away. Some of the other variations that you can do for this pocket are straightening it off here so that you don't have this curve at all. And it also makes it a little deeper right here, which is kind of helpful, especially when your pocket opening is so close to the bag of the pocket. I find that putting my phone in this size and in this shape pocket, it's not as secure, but I'm not also doing cartwheels on the lawn anymore, so you know there's that. But if you want to make sure that you have more pocket depth and a little bit more security, you might consider just straightening it off right here or making it a little bit deeper. Bigger is not always better though, so just exercise caution. All right, so I'm just kind of tightening up this edge from where I'm going to turn it. Right now I've got all my gathers in there and I just kind of start taking them out. All I wanted was a tight edge there. Some machines you can actually put your stitch length down pretty small and then as you're sewing kind of tighten it up, or if you use a reverse differential that can help you, but I don't really have that differential on my industrial here, so I'm not going to do that. And I'm a little more old school than that, I think, too. But those methods are great. As long as you know your machine, you can trust them. I think that those are pretty nifty. All right, so let's just iron under this edge. All right, ironing that didn't take too long. Don't forget you're going towards the right side, because I did, and I had to do it twice. So it wouldn't have taken even as long if I'd remembered. So, all right, we're going to place this face down here. Make sure that you're covering the opening. And you can adjust your pocket size if you're, it just depends on what style finish you're doing there. If you want it to look a little more seamless, I would understand that. With the stitching is what I mean. All right, so I'm going to put a couple pins in here just to hold it down. Make sure it's nice and flat, and then we'll edge stitch it. Now nobody's going to see this on the inside of your garment but you. But I know what you're thinking. You do really want it to be nice. Just remember that though. I don't think my little cozy cocos are lining up like I planned. Nope, they aren't. That's because I cut it twice and I totally forgot I was doing that. So, but I think you get the point that you could actually make it pretty seamless. So, such a cute fabric. All right, here we go. Here's our last one here. And we'll sew up this little side here. I made this one pattern for all of these styles for my Patreon patrons. And definitely once you have sewn a couple, you'll kind of know the adjustments that you would want to make. Like this would probably be deeper right here, so I had a little bit more pocket bag there below this opening, and some of the others not so much. So it just depends on what you're doing and what fabric you're using. This is a Kona cotton, so it's pretty stable. All right, well, I hope that works out for you. Just remember that this is pretty versatile, and just to think about how you want your garment to feel, how you want it to drape, and remember that that you can make any change you want and any finish technique that you like to do. Good luck.